What if one sentence, just one, spoken by a US congresswoman, brought the president of an African nation to tears and forced Washington to face a truth it had buried for decades? Stay with us, because what Jasmine Crockett said didn't just shake a room, it cracked open history, and President Ibrahim Traoré's reaction will leave you speechless. Dear friends, what you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a glimpse into a world where quiet courage reshapes destinies and dignity outshines power. These are the voices often missed by the headlines, but not here. If this kind of storytelling moves you, if it stays with you long after the screen fades, we invite you to subscribe and ring the bell. And before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. We read every word. Now let's begin. Under the searing lights of Capitol Hill, where political rhetoric often blurs into performance, something rare unfolded. A silence that felt like thunder. The usual choreography of diplomacy was shattered in a single moment, one that sent shockwaves from Washington to the dusty courtyards of Ouagadougou. On that day, in what was meant to be a standard video conference about agricultural cooperation, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso found himself holding back tears, not from weakness, but from the weight of something long denied: truth. On the other end of the screen sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Known for her unapologetic candor and fierce defense of marginalized voices, she wasn't there to charm or to posture. She was there to break a pattern, and she did so with just one sentence. A sentence not written by aides, not screened by diplomats, but pulled straight from a reservoir of collective frustration that had simmered for decades. Africa doesn't need saving. It needs to be heard. The words were not screamed. They were delivered with a clarity that cut deeper than noise. For a second, no one breathed. Even the translator paused, unsure whether to repeat something so piercing. But the sentence, once spoken, couldn't be unsaid. And it landed like a stone on centuries of colonial narratives, foreign aid tied with chains, and assumptions dressed as partnerships. Traoré, a soldier-turned-president who had seen battlefields and boardrooms, wasn't moved by sentiment. He was moved because in that moment, a foreign voice didn't lecture, didn't offer sympathy. It did something more dangerous. It recognized him. It validated the fight he had been waging not only on the ground, but in the global perception of African leadership. That one sentence became a rupture point. From newsrooms to parliaments, from Harlem to Harare, people weren't just reacting, they were rethinking. What if this wasn't a diplomatic blunder? What if it was the most honest moment in recent geopolitical history? And more importantly, what happens next when the world hears what it was never meant to? Keep listening. The storm had just begun. There was a storm brewing long before Jasmine Crockett's words reached President Ibrahim Traoré. It had been building in quiet moments, when African leaders were sidelined in negotiations, when voices from the global south were sanitized or silenced under the pretext of decorum. Jasmine Crockett had felt it. She had lived it. And in that moment, on a muted video call dressed in diplomatic pleasantries, she decided to crack the silence wide open. Behind her sat a stack of prepared remarks, safe, predictable, approved. But Jasmine saw them for what they were, a mask. She didn't come to read a script. She came to speak a truth she had carried for years. One born not in think tanks but in real conversations with communities both in the United States and abroad, people whose lives were shaped by policies made without their voices. She began slowly, deliberately, not with rhetoric, but with reckoning. And as she spoke, there was no flourish, no performance. Just steady, unflinching honesty. Her voice did not rise, but its weight was unmistakable. "Why?" she asked. "Do we only offer aid when we can dictate its use? That wasn't a question for debate. It was a mirror held up to power. Her words weren't meant to flatter the audience back home. They were meant to confront them, to ask what it truly means to be a partner and not a puppeteer. As she invoked the legacy of Thomas Sankara, as she wove Traoré's vision into a larger story of dignity and resistance, she did more than offer praise. She drew a line. The moment became larger than the call. It became a declaration that acknowledging someone's struggle does not mean condoning everything they do, but it does mean seeing them fully on their own terms. What Jasmine did was rare. In a world where diplomacy often hides behind euphemism, she chose clarity. In a political climate where careers are built on calculation, she chose conscience. And that choice, not just to speak, but to speak plainly, made her dangerous in the best way possible. She didn't come to play by the rules. She came to rewrite them. When the screen dimmed and Jasmine Crockett's voice gave way to silence, President Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless. His hands rested on the desk, but his breath had slowed, as though absorbing every syllable that had shattered the usual script of diplomatic exchanges. It was not the first time he had heard Western officials speak of aid, democracy, or reform, but never like this. Never from a voice that asked not for compliance, but for understanding. Not for allegiance, but for truth. And certainly never from someone who was willing to confront her own country's complicity in systems that suffocate the very sovereignty they claim to support. For a full minute, Traoré didn't speak. Around him, aides whispered nervously, unsure whether to begin the prepared agenda. But he remained still, his gaze locked not on a policy document, but on the faint after-image of Jasmine's face on the screen. Then slowly he rose, not with the weight of pride, but with the weight of realization. What had been said couldn't be dismissed. It had pierced through years of diplomatic posturing, through fatigue, through mistrust. And it had landed not just in his mind, but in his heart. That night, Traoré did something he rarely did. He cancelled all briefings. He asked for no speechwriters. Instead, he took a solitary walk through the palace courtyard, letting the wind and silence guide his thoughts. He wasn't thinking about politics. He was thinking about responsibility, about what it meant to be truly heard, about the young girl in a village who might never know Jasmine Crockett's name, but whose future might hinge on this moment of clarity. By morning, action had replaced stillness. Traoré summoned a small team, not ministers, not generals, but educators, farmers, young community leaders. "We begin today," he told them, "not by building a response, but by building a country that no longer needs to prove itself worthy of dignity." Jasmine's words hadn't just moved him. They had pushed him past pride into purpose. Her courage had sparked his own. The silence had broken, and from it a new resolve had risen. The ripple from Jasmine Crockett's words didn't stop at the walls of Ibrahim Traoré's office. It surged across continents, cracking through the polished facades of international diplomacy and stirring conversations that had long been buried beneath convenience and control. Within hours, clips of her unscripted remarks began circulating online, not as a political scandal, but as a call to conscience. In Nairobi, university students projected her face onto campus walls beside phrases like, "Hear us, don't help us." In Dakar, youth-led movements held impromptu forums titled, "The Day We Were Finally Seen." In Harlem, spoken-word artists wove her sentence into new verses, igniting packed rooms with applause and tears. The most surprising reactions, however, came from within America itself. On social media, Veterans of civil rights movements, public school teachers, and even disillusioned policy analysts began quoting Jasmine's line, "Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard." That sentence, a sentence spoken without theatrics or pretense, was now being taught in community centers and shared in sermons. It wasn't just what she said, it was what it revealed. The world had grown so used to silence from leaders who looked like her that when she finally spoke with honesty, it cracked open something forgotten, the right to be unapologetically human. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, a quiet transformation was underway. In the northern region of Ouahigouya, a small school, once lacking chalk, textbooks, and even desks, received its first shipment of supplies funded not by foreign contracts but by a grassroots campaign sparked by Jasmine's message. Locals named it the Listening Tree Initiative, a nod to her call for mutual understanding instead of conditional charity. Even in the remote hills of Bobo Dioulasso, murals began to appear. Images of children holding hands with the words, "We are not aid, we are allies." What had begun as a tense diplomatic exchange had evolved into something far more powerful, a reimagining of solidarity. Not top-down, not forced, but chosen. And in that rare moment when truth met humility on a global stage, new hope was born, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every corner of the world still waiting to be heard. In the weeks that followed the historic exchange, something remarkable took root across Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré, once defined by his military resolve, began to be seen through a different lens, not just as a soldier or head of state, but as a steward of dignity. Inspired by Jasmine Crockett's audacity, he issued a public decree that would reshape his country's development approach. No more contracts signed without community consultation, no more foreign aid accepted unless it respected local wisdom. It was a shift from dependency to dignity, from policy built in silence to decisions rooted in dialogue. In rural districts like Koudougou and Manga, village assemblies were formed to identify their own priorities, from building clean water systems to establishing schools powered by solar grids. Elders, mothers, youth, even previously ignored ethnic minorities were brought into these forums as equal voices. Traoré mandated that government officials attend not to speak but to listen, and listen they did. The cries of forgotten communities began to shape budgets, direct infrastructure, and inform constitutional reforms. At the National University in Ouagadougou, a new department was inaugurated, Civic Ethics and Cultural Sovereignty. Its founding curriculum included excerpts from Jasmine Crockett's speech and essays reflecting on the line, "Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard." Students who once memorized colonial political systems now debated what democracy could look like if it truly reflected their soil, their struggles, and their strength. But perhaps the most powerful shift occurred not in buildings or budgets, but in belief. In a primary school classroom, a girl named Maimouna wrote a short sentence in her first journal, "I am not poor, I am proud." Her teacher, wiping away quiet tears, pinned it to the wall. That wall would soon be covered with similar truths written by children who, for the first time, saw themselves not as recipients of pity, but as authors of change. And thus the legacy began, not in policy papers alone, but in lives altered by a shared truth. Dignity had become more than an idea. It had become law. It had become culture. It had become the new foundation on which the future of Burkina Faso would be built, boldly, proudly, and entirely its own. In the story of President Ibrahim Traoré and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, we witnessed not just a political exchange, but the ignition of a global conversation on dignity, sovereignty, and the true meaning of leadership. What began as a scheduled diplomatic call transformed into a historic reckoning when Jasmine chose honesty over comfort and courage over convention. With one sentence, "Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard," she cracked the silence wide open and reminded the world that dignity is not something granted, it is something deserved. Her words didn't just travel across borders, they awakened something long buried in the hearts of millions: the right to be seen, the right to be respected, and the right to define one's future. For Ibrahim Traoré, her words became more than validation. They became a call to deepen his mission. No longer just a transitional leader, he emerged as a symbol of what it means to lead with purpose. From the halls of power in Ouagadougou to the dusty schoolrooms of forgotten villages, his response to Crockett's defiance was not anger, but action. He turned silence into consultation, transformed aid into partnership, and placed the people, not politics, at the center of reform. The lesson is profound. Real change does not begin in grand speeches or foreign capital. It begins in listening. It begins when one leader dares to speak the truth and another dares to hear it. We live in a world that often rewards performance over purpose, but this story shows us that when we center dignity, when we choose to serve instead of rule and listen instead of dictate, something deeper takes root. We begin to change not only systems, but souls. So ask yourself, in your own life, where can you choose to listen more? Whose voices have gone unheard for too long? And how can your actions echo the courage we saw between Traoré and Crockett? Now a question for you. Which sentence did Jasmine Crockett use that caused a global stir? A. Africa needs more aid and guidance. B. Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard. Comment your answer below with A or B. What did this story make you feel? Do you agree with Jasmine's approach or Traoré's response? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice. And if you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more real stories that matter to life. See you in the next chapter.